When we talk about consent, what do we mean by consent? And usually when we talk about consent, it means that is a communication between a patient and a physician that results in patient authorization. In other words, it can also mean that there is an agreement to undergo a specific medical intervention. Now, assent is little different from consent. Okay. When you say assent means you agree for the procedure, you do not know whether it is good or it is bad. Whereas when you give consent, you understand the consequences of your action, whether it is good or bad, and then you give a consent. Understood? This is the basic difference. When you say assent, you agree for any procedure. You are not capable of understanding whether it is good, bad, or what is going to happen with that procedure. So, a child below the age of 7 years is totally cannot understand what is happening to it. From the age of 7, from philosophical point, it is understood that the child will be able to discriminate what is good, what is bad. And as the child grows up in age, the discrimination keeps increasing. Just because a child becomes 18 does not mean that child can discriminate. Now, if a child is celebrating birthday tomorrow, today he is not able to discriminate, tomorrow he is totally able to discriminate. Okay. So, this concept has to be understood. The legal term of 18 years is 18 years, but the maturity at which you judge may be different. We have the concept of a mature minor. Okay. If a person can understand the consequences of the action, it is for the court to judge whether you are able to understand the consequences of your action, and the child is considered to be a major. Like for example, a child who is a teenage mother who refuses to undergo an abortion, but the parents want to take abortion. This was a case in the Supreme Court where the decision went in favor of the teenage mother because she understood the consequences of conception. Okay. So, this is a very important concept that we need to understand. Now, when we talk about consent, why do we need consent? It is a legal and ethical reason. Okay. In medicine, when you talk about medical ethics, there are some parts of the topics in medical ethics where most of the discussion is on a ethical framework, and there are some parts of medical ethics where most of the discussion is on a legal framework. When it comes to consent, there is one place in medical ethics where both legal as well as ethical issues agree on point. Okay. Then consent is also necessary because it minimizes potential harm to the patient. Like for example, if without a consent you give a drug and the person develops a side effect of the drug, he will not come and report to you. So, it becomes essential that you take consent so that you can protect from potential this thing, and it avoids unfairness and exploitation, and lastly it protects the patient's rights. Okay. These are the reasons why we need to take consent from the patient. Now, advantages of consent in a clinical setting is it improves doctor-patient relationship. It clarifies what are the objectives of treatment and gives a framework for the doctor to act. And lastly, patient may cooperate fully with the treatment. In fact, when I was preparing for this lecture, I read a thing is olden days before anesthesia came about, patients were explained what was being done so that they will bear the pain better. And that is how one of the ways consent became a very important aspect of doctor-patient relationship. Okay. Next, when we talk about ethical basis of consent, there are three things that we talk about. One is on the principle of autonomy of the person. Okay. Consent is necessary because we respect the person's autonomy, that is liberty, and the capacity for intentional action, that is the agency. And respecting autonomy of person is to minimally acknowledge that the person has a right to hold views and make choices, and to make choices based on personal values and beliefs. Okay. So, autonomy means that you are able to make your choices on personal values and belief systems, and you have a right to hold your own views. This is where the conflict arises. The doctor says you do this and the patient says no, sorry, I do not want to do this. Then you say this patient is a very bad patient, he does not listen to what the doctors say. But remember, we need to handle the autonomy of the patients as much as possible. Then, and when we need to respect autonomy of a person, we look at Kant. Kant said all persons have unconditional worth. Each person has capacity to determine his or her own moral worth, and it is the basis of treating persons as an end in itself, not as a means to an end. This is one of the basic principles of Kantianism. When you talk about utilitarianism, which is again the philosopher Mill talked about, society should allow individuals to develop according to their convictions as long as they do not interfere with the expression of freedom by others. Now, rights is what we always talk about very often these days, and now the predominant bioethics that we talk about is based on rights. And in 1914, the Supreme Court of America decided that every human being of adult years and sound mind has a right to determine what shall be done with his own body. So, this is the ethical principle or the legal principle that goes behind the consent. Now, when we come to the legal basis, there is consent comes on battery, which is liability is imposed for permitting touching, and negligence. And today, most of the legal questions that arise in consent are in relation to negligence. When we come to the Indian Penal Code, there are 4 sections that deal with consent, which is essential. Act, that is section 88, act not intended to cause death done by consent in good faith for the person's benefit. Act done in good faith for, that is the protective act that you have when you enter in emergencies. Act done in good faith for the benefit of a child or insane person by the consent of a guardian. Consequent defense when there is not known to be any likely cause for death or grievous injury. Excludes requirement of consent for an act done for the benefit of a person. So, these are the 4 sections in the Indian Penal Code that talks about consent as an important requirement. Now, when we come to the Medical Code of India, it says 7.16, before performing an operation, the physician should obtain in writing the consent from the husband or wife, parent or guardian in case of a minor, or the patient himself as the case may be. In operations which result in sterility, the consent of both the husband and wife is needed. Okay. Now, the first part of it we all practice. Do we practice the second part? Do we obtain consent from the spouses when you are doing family planning operations? No.
It is mandatory. I mean, it is just done. It doesn't really.
No. According to the government, this is the problem. See, in our country, the medical council will talk something, the government will talk another thing. According to the Government of India Act, the person undergoing the family planning operation is the one who has to give consent for the surgery. It is not the husband or the family or anybody. Okay, that is why they talk about vasectomy camps, tubectomy camps, where people can just give consent and get the surgery done. Okay, but this is this thing it says about. Then the second point that medical code talks about is in relation to publishing photographs and clinical material, case reports. Previously, those of you who have been following medical journals, about 10-15 years ago, there was no permission required to publish a photograph or a case. Nowadays, if you go, especially international journals like BMJ, if you look back the issues where they release interesting cases or photographs, there will always be a statement saying permission was granted by the patient for this publication. So, the same thing has been incorporated into the medical council code for consent. Then, how much of information to give also is mentioned in the medical council. It says a physician should neither exaggerate nor minimize the gravity of the patient's condition. He must ensure himself that the patient, his relative or his responsible friends have such knowledge of patient's condition as well as serve the best interest of the patient and the family. So, almost most of the codes that you see always talk about the individual patient, but here is one place where you say you not only talk about the individual, but you also have to include the family in the decision making. Okay. Now, what are the elements of consent? There are 3 major elements of consent. One is the threshold elements that are necessary, that is, person should be competent to give consent. Second thing is consent must be voluntary, and the third this thing is informational content element that consists of disclosure, recommendation and understanding. See, this is important to understand. As a doctor, it is not just giving all the therapeutic options and telling the patient you choose. You are bound to give a recommendation. Okay. and you must see that the patient understands what recommendation you give. Patient may not agree with what you say, then you have conflict. Then we have decision making. The patient decides to undergo surgery and he authorizes you to undergo surgery. That is where you take written consent. Okay. So, these are all the different various aspects when you talk about consent. What do you mean by competence? When you say capacity or ability to perform a task, okay, and competence can vary, okay, and competence varies from context to context. Okay. I may be a good talker, but I may be a lousy writer. Just because I talk does not mean I am a competent writer. Okay. I may be a lousy car driver, that does not mean that I am very competent to drive a car. So, it varies from context to context, and usually competence is specific, it is not global for anything, and competence may vary over time. Okay. And now, there are different standards that have been applied for competence. What I would like you to look at is the competence is judged by 5, 6 and 7. Inability to give a rational reason, inability to give risk benefit related reasons, inability to reach a reasonable decision. When patients make these type of things, then you consider that they are incompetent, not because they do not agree with what you say. Okay. Now, we always work on the presumption that every adult is competent to decide what he has to do. Okay. And if the patient's choice appears irrational or does not accord with the doctor's view of what is the patient's best interest, that is not evidence in itself to say that patient is incompetent. And if there is a question of incompetence, we need to refer to a second person or a psychiatrist to assess whether the patient is incompetent or not. Now, I will give you this story. Mahesh is a 33-year-old man. He is mentally incapacitated. He is being looked after by his only sibling Rajesh, a police constable. Rajesh is sole breadwinner of the family. He is suffering from chronic renal failure and he needs a transplant. The only donor available is Mahesh. His mother agrees to donate his kidney for his brother Rajesh. Is this justifiable? See, the point that you have to think here is how incapacitated is Mahesh to decide. If he is totally incapacitated, then the mother has a right to give, to agree for it. But if he has capacity to decide whether he wants to give his kidney or not, we must respect Mahesh's decision. The whole controversy on this transplant was this. The family thought he is not capable of deciding, psychiatrist thought he is capable of deciding. This is the crux of the problem in this case. Okay. Ultimately, he did not donate the kidney. Okay. Now, we talk about surrogate decision making. Okay. Are persons who make decisions for incompetent patient, and usually a quality of surrogate decision maker is commitment to incompetent person's welfare, that is very important. Second is the ability to make a reasoned judgment, adequate knowledge and information, and must be emotionally stable. Now, the surrogates become very important when you are dealing with patients, especially when you are dealing with people who are mentally incapacitated or people who are living alone, who do not have an immediate family. This happens very often when you have the family abroad and the parents staying here. You know, one of them will be there alone, living with his friends and things, and if something happens, somebody has to take a decision. And by the time the son, who is supposed to be a legal person, comes from America or wherever he is, decision